Hello, everybody. I'm sure some of you, at least, will remember Tarantino's movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, a controversial film. I rather liked it. I like most of Tarantino's stuff, but he got himself into trouble because of his depiction of Bruce Lee, which he has refused for one reason or another to apologize about. And I thought of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the 2019 movie, to prepare for our conversation today, not about Tarantino, but about Bruce Lee himself. It's a major new biography of Lee by one of America's leading cultural commentators, the Berkeley-based Jeff Chang. The book is called Water Mirror Echo, Bruce Lee and the Making of Asian America. And I'm thrilled that Jeff is joining us from Ashby and San Pablo in Berkeley, my favorite East Bay resort. I don't know, hangout, I don't know what you call it, Jeff. What's your take on, I'm sure you've given it some thought, on the Tarantino portrayal, if that's the right word, of Lee in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's a school of thought that Bruce was just a narcissistic, kind of egotistical kind of guy. And you see that actually in movie criticism, film criticism, but you also hear it every once in a while from folks who just don't like the guy. Albert Goldman, who famously tried to take down Elvis Presley, wrote a story way back in the day in Playboy magazine, or was it Penthouse, where he just...
Easy to confuse the two, Joe.
Yeah, but Albert Goldman tried to do a big takedown back in the day, and that was one of his chief accusations, that this was just a little guy who thought he was a little bit higher than what his stage in life should have been. And I think Tarantino kind of thinks about him the same way. I think that one of the things that Tarantino talks about is that Bruce manhandled and mistreated a lot of the white stuntmen that he was on the set with. And unfortunately, I think he got his story wrong. But that's sort of what I think maybe was the impetus for him doing that scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, was sort of getting some sort of cinematic justice on behalf of the working guys, the white working guys back in the day in Hollywood, the stunt guys.
Although I never really associate Tarantino with social justice. I remember my daughter at the time, as a teenager, refused to go to the movie because she claimed that Tarantino was anti-Asian.
Mm-hmm.
Your book, with its subtitle Bruce Lee and the Making of Asian America, obviously focuses in some ways on his ethnicity and his culture. Mm-hmm. Is that where we need to begin and end with Lee?
I don't necessarily think so, but it was where I wanted to. There's been a lot of writing on Bruce, and so what can I add to the canon? I was really interested in him as somebody who was and is sort of the most famous Asian American ever. He's born in San Francisco in 1940, so he's born American, and he grows up in Hong Kong, and then he comes back to the U.S. in 1959 as a teenager, because he's gotten into one too many fights in Hong Kong, and he begins to epitomize, I think, a lot of the Asian American experience at that particular point. He's an immigrant. He's living in a segregated community in Seattle, and also here in San Francisco for a short time. And he is struggling like a lot of other migrants to this country. And that was, I think, where this kid who grew up fairly privileged in Hong Kong actually learned what it meant to be the underdog, and now continues to be the underdog hero around the globe.
Jeff, when I think of, and we talked about this a little bit before we went live, when I think of Bruce Lee, I think obviously of movies like Way of the Dragon, Enter the Dragon, previous movies like Fist of Fury. Mm-hmm. Do we need to think of him as a movie guy, or do we need to think of him in a deeper or different kind of sense?
I like to think that he was a lot more than what he appeared to be on the screen. And so in that sense, that's the tack that I took in coming to this book. We know all about his movies. Actually, I mean, maybe we don't know all about his movies. We know about his movies after he came back to Hong Kong in 1971. These ones that you're flashing on the screen, but we actually don't know much about his life at all. He has the impact around the world of somebody like Bob Marley or Muhammad Ali,
Mm.
right? In terms of the kind of space he occupies in people's imaginations. Um, but we know about Ali, we know about Bob Marley. We don't know too much about Bruce and how he grew up and the kinds of things that he went through. And I think that's because a lot of folks actually don't have a strong picture of what it is that Asian Americans go through. And so in my book, I am trying to remedy that, trying to remedy maybe the gaps that people might have in their knowledge about Bruce Lee, but also the gaps that they might have in their knowledge about Asian America.
Yeah, and your work in the past has focused on, shall we say, the intersection of politics and culture. Your book, "Can't Stop, Won't Stop," is one of the most acclaimed histories of hip hop. In fact, one of the most acclaimed contemporary cultural studies of the last 25 years, included on all sorts of lists. Although some people might wonder, with this subtitle, "Bruce Lee in the Making of Asian America," what Bruce Lee might have had to do with some of those old Asian ladies wandering around Chinatown, for example.
Yeah.
So perhaps you might tell us a little bit about Lee, his background, and perhaps his politics, because I personally had never really thought of Lee in political terms.
Yeah. It's interesting. Bruce was like a lot of those old ladies wandering around Chinatown because, when he comes back to the US, again, at the age of 18, he is somebody who is living in segregated Chinatown. If he goes a few blocks up the hill, he's in Nob Hill and he's not wanted there. And if he goes a few blocks down the hill, he's in the financial district and he's not wanted there. So he is immediately learning what it means to be a racialized minority. And in that way, he's no different from the old folks in Portsmouth Square, or the angry young men in Chinatown at that particular period. There was a rise in gang violence that was happening. He kind of gets caught up on the outskirts of that. And when he moves to Seattle, he's living in the Central District, which is a segregated district, and so he's in a 95% white city, and he's living with a lot of folks of color, Black folks, Latino folks, Native American folks, other Asian folks, Japanese Americans, and Filipino Americans. And he's learning from them what it means, again, to be a racialized minority. He's literally hanging out at the same high school that produced Jimi Hendrix and Quincy Jones. And so there's this kind of fertile cultural creativity that's happening in the Central District. In some ways, because it's segregated, it looks like the future of America, right? And there's all this kind of mixing, and he is 20 years old, but people are coming to him to ask him if they would teach them kung fu. And so his first student is a Black student named Jesse Glover, who at the age of 12 was brutally beaten by police. And his another friend of his is Taki Kimura, who's 18 years older than him. But when he was 18, he was being put on a train to go to an incarceration camp during World War II because he was Japanese American. And so from them, he's learning about America. And I think that really shapes, the person that he becomes. He identifies with the underdog, and in his movies, as you said, Fist of Fury, The Big Boss, Way of the Dragon, Enter the Dragon, he's playing these underdog types of characters. In Enter the Dragon, he is sort of trying to express almost like a third world kind of solidarity in the same way that Bob Marley is and Muhammad Ali is in that year in 1973.
Although, of course, Marley in particular, Muhammad Ali, were complicated, controversial figures. You talk about angry young men in Chinatown. I'm not actually particularly well versed in the political or social history of Chinatown, or even the Chinese community in Northern California. But was that anger directly political? Was it cultural? Was it genderized? Well, why were they so angry?
I think, what you see in the early 1960s is young folks really chafing at the restrictions of segregation. You know, they're influenced, I think, by the rising civil rights movement and anti-racist movements that are happening simultaneous to that. There's also a lot of immigration for the first time into Chinatown, really since the 1800s. You know, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 really cuts off immigration for the better part of a century, and what you see is a relaxation of that in the mid 1960s. And so a lot of young folks, you know, again, chafing at these restrictions and at the same time getting into fights, you know, between immigrants and folks who have been born in the US, the so-called fresh off the boats and the so-called ABCs, American born Chinese. So that's one of the things that Bruce gets caught up in. You know, he's seen as a bad immigrant, and he's seen by a lot of the older folks in Chinatown as somebody who's stirring up the pot. And so there's a part in the book where I get into one of his big sort of fights that he has. It's a legendary fight with another immigrant who's seen as the good immigrant in Chinatown. But it turns right in the by the time you get to the late 1960s, the anger has been turned outward, and there's now a new language for a political kind of take on what it means to be Chinese American or Asian American. Um, there's a term Asian American that gets formed in 1968, actually out of house here in Berkeley, and it spreads across the Bay Area, then across the country in the same way that so-called Negroes are renaming themselves Black, and so-called Mexicans are renaming themselves Chicanos. Um, you know, indigenous folks are renaming themselves American Indians, or so-called Orientals are renaming themselves Asian American. They're saying we have to fight for our rights. And so Bruce is not in the middle of this. He's by this time he's already living in Los Angeles, but when he comes to prominence in his movies, he very much represents this kind of a spirit. And so I'm trying to write about a parallel story here, the rise of Bruce Lee and the rise of this idea of Asian America, which is this idea that we're not going to be stepped on anymore. We're going to stand up for ourselves. We're going to refuse representations that don't look like us. We're going to actually make something of ourselves and make ourselves equal, in this U.S. That's been so oppressive to us.
You talk about Asian American, Jeff. Obviously, it's not just Chinese American; it's Vietnamese. I mean, America back then was still involved in the Vietnam War.
Absolutely.
As Japanese Americans and relations historically, culturally between Japanese and Chinese, of course, are enormously fraught and complicated. How did that work out on the ground in Asian American cities like Seattle and San Francisco? Was there a deep suspicion between the Vietnamese, the Japanese, the Chinese communities, or did they think of themselves once they came to America as simply or did they begin to think of themselves as Asian Americans, perhaps because of some of the stuff that Bruce Lee was doing?
Yeah, well, I think part of the stuff that Bruce Lee was doing, but also, you know, to the outside world, we all look the same, right? Everybody was Chinese, whether you're Filipino or Japanese or that kind of stuff. Everybody was seen as Chinese at certain points. During the wartime, you know, everybody was seen as Japanese. There was always mistaken identity, and even though there's, you know, folks are coming from the old countries, with different kinds of histories and here histories of enmity, right? Histories of tension and war between the different folks. You come to the U.S. and you're treated pretty much the same, right? So there, everybody I think in this generation that comes to call themselves Asian American is looking at the war in Vietnam, and they're realizing they're all getting called Gook on the streets as well. They're all getting called Chink on the streets as well. They identify with the folks that the U.S. is bombing. Even the anti-war movement at the time, right? The anti-war movement was talking about bringing the troops home, but Asian Americans were like, we have to just end the war because these are our people, you know. And so they brought in the anti-war movement, and I think that the Asian American ideal at that time was very much this idea of we're all in this together. We all have to kind of see ourselves as fighting a common fight. We have to form a sense of solidarity. And I think that's what Bruce comes to represent. You know, when Bruce's movies come back to Chinatown in the early 1970s, you're seeing all kinds of Asian Americans coming into these theaters in Chinatown, Manila Town, and San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and Seattle, and all these other places. And you're seeing a lot of other folks who identify with those underdogs as well, white folks, black folks, Latino folks, and everybody is cheering together when Bruce is kicking down signs that say, "No Chinese and dogs allowed in this park."
So, and again, excuse the innocence of this question,
No, not at all.
Jeff.
Yeah.
Now, when I think of Bruce Lee, and I'm anything but an expert on him, I don't think of him, or I don't think of his work, the movies that made his name, as being political. But are you suggesting they are?
I think they are. I mean, if you look at a movie like Fist of Fury, it's openly, you know, anti-imperial. It's anti-colonialist, right? This is covering a particular period when the Japanese occupied Shanghai, and so, you know, so you have these signs going up in these different types of parks in which Chinese are not allowed into those parks unless they are servants of foreigners, of the British folks or the French folks, or later on of you know, Japanese folks. And you know, his first movie that he makes, The Big Boss, is it's a labor story. It's a story of labor solidarity. They're fighting a murderous big boss, and they're trying to get their rights. And the big boss ends up, you know, killing all of the workers. And Bruce is identifying with the workers. He's getting courted by the big boss, but he eventually identifies with the workers. And when the big boss kills all the workers, he seeks vengeance on their behalf. You know, so these are movies in which, and then we get to Way of the Dragon, right? The movie that you were talking about. We're talking about Bruce standing in for a restaurant, a Chinatown restaurant that the gentrifiers literally want to take over. They want to redevelop Chinatown and wipe out the restaurant while they're extorting it at the same time. So, you know, Bruce is identifying with the underdogs in all of his movies, and I think that that's why he becomes such a hero to so many people. It's why we're still talking about Bruce Lee, whereas, you know, a lot of the other folks in Hollywood who were action heroes at the time, we're not talking about them anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. You have an excellent Substack, Notes from the Edge, and you had one about how working class Asians helped secure Zoran's victory. Zoran Mandami, of course, in New York City, a man of the left too. But Asian Americans don't, when one thinks of Asian Americans in America today, one doesn't think of them as being always on the left. I mean, would it be fair to say that your presentation of Bruce is as a progressive, a rebel? I mean, I don't want to generalize about the Asian American community, Jeff, because I'm not sure whether that's either I'm certainly not equipped to anyway, and it's not appropriate. But were some Asian Americans at least somehow put off by the anti-imperialist progressive message in Bruce Lee's work?
Oh, 2000%. Yeah, I'm sure. You know, it's like any other community, right? There's a lot of diverse opinions in the community. We could talk about Zoran endlessly. That particular article was about how working class Asian Americans formed really the core of Mamdani's campaign in the primaries to secure the win there over Andrew Cuomo. The way that it relates, I think, to this is that I think Bruce came to be seen by a lot of folks in the Asian American community as representing them, as somebody who captured their sense of being underdogs, of being neglected, of being shamed for who they were, and I think that that continues until today. You know, I think that what you saw during the pandemic, when there
Mm.
was violence against Asian Americans that was spiking against us, was that Bruce came back as a symbol in our communities. He was suddenly appearing in these murals in Chinatown and in Asian American communities. He was appearing on all of our social feeds, on the Asian American sort of Instagram kind of feeds, or TikTok feeds. He became a symbol. He was really a symbol of like pride and power, right? And solidarity and unity during this time in which we were all feeling very vulnerable, very isolated, very put upon. And so, people can read the book in different kinds of ways. People might be, oh, that's a leftist take on it. I don't think it's necessarily a leftist take. I don't think it's a rightist take. I don't think it's that kind of thing. I think it's literally the story of how he came to represent a people, and what we continue to see in him.
You describe him intriguingly as an anchor baby. What do you mean by that?
In the language of today's fraught, divided debate over immigration, there's a lot of sort of terms that get thrown around. One of them is anchor baby. Anchor baby is supposedly somebody who, undocumented folks come to the US to have their baby in the US so their kid can be documented, can be a citizen by birthright citizenship, and in that way make them, petition for them to become citizens. It's unbelievable conspiracy theory that's, I mean, literally unbelievable. There's not much evidence for so-called birth tourism out there, even though there have been, government efforts to try to find this and root it out. It's a non-existent problem, and uh, and so in those terms, right? Bruce would have been somebody who would have been called that, an anchor baby. If you look at the executive order that Donald Trump issues on the first day of his time in office, he's trying to basically undo this concept of birthright citizenship, which is that anybody who's born in the U.S. is a U.S. citizen. And it's on terms like anchor baby and these sort of false stories, these false narratives that that kind of thing is based. So it's really important, I think, for folks to be able to understand that Bruce, who is a quintessential American, he's not just a quintessential Asian.
Yeah, with the quintessential name, Bruce of all.
Right, exactly. Bruce Lee, right? He could be called, you could call him Lee, and he'd sound like a quintessential American, right? That in this particular climate around immigration, that he's somebody who would be targeted by certain folks, and that's a political point, yes, but it's also a fact. It's also a fact. When Bruce was born, the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in place, and so it's, I think, part of the story of Asian America for us to be able to remind people that this is not so long ago, and it's still very live right now.
You got all sorts of interesting posts on the book, on your Notes from the Edge Substack. You say Bruce Lee had no game, which of course is slightly
It's
tongue in
overstated.
cheek.
It's tongue in cheek, absolutely. But as a teenager, we think of him, right, as sort of this ideal of manhood or whatever. Folks want to be like him or they want to be with him, right? And yet, as a kid, he was incredibly shy around women. He was a handsome guy. He was in the movies. He was a movie star as a child actor and as a teen actor. But he couldn't get with the girls. He had no game. He had no lines. When he was hanging out and girls wanted to talk to him, he'd be like, "Feel my muscles." You know what I mean?
Yeah, probably not the best chat up line.
Yeah, it's not the greatest first line in the world, I don't think.
You also write very intriguingly about why hip hop loves Bruce Lee. As I said, you're the author of Can't Stop, Won't Stop.
Mm-hmm.
The relations between African Americans and Asian Americans haven't always been ideal. Maybe politically, on some progressive fronts, there's lots of bridges, but also lots of fraught episodes in their relations. What's the relationship, in your view, between hip hop and Lee. And were you in a way, Jeff? Keep on meaning to call you Bruce. That would get me into trouble. Were you led to this? It's a big project. You've spent a
Yeah,
lot of time doing it. Were you led to this book by your hip hop book?
absolutely. In fact, what happened was I had written this book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation, 20 years ago, actually. This year it came out. And shortly after that, an Asian American editor, in the business came to me and he said, you did this book on Bruce Lee. You should be, I mean, you did this book on hip hop, he said. And so you should be able to do a book on Bruce Lee, right? And I was like, yeah, I can do that. He saw in the hip hop book the seeds, I suppose, of what eventually all these years later became this particular book, Water Mirror Echo. So hip hop is what brought him to me. He was like, "Here's an Asian American who's down for hip hop, then he should be able to write about Bruce Lee, who's like the most hip hop Asian American ever."
What do you mean by that? The most
Well,
hip
I
hop?
mean that he's been embraced by uh, folks in hip hop culture. I mean, the most obvious, right, link here is the Wu-Tang Clan
Right.
and RZA, who's made his own kung fu movies and who idolizes just Bruce is his superhero. I mean, he's part of a generation like the rest of us that grew up watching these movies either at inner city theaters or on television, right? And so for them, he was the epitome of the underdog. Like they saw themselves in him, and I think that that's why you have like this amazing dialogue between Asian Americans and African Americans and Black Americans through the figure of Bruce. There's a really interesting hidden history here, though, which is that in the 1970s, the studio system, the Hollywood studio system was collapsing. And what saved them was black exploitation movies, right? So
Mm.
Superfly, Shaft, before that, I mean, the one that set it off was Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. And these were movies that were made for the most part independently, and the studios were like, "Oh, we'll throw in some money, we'll give you a distribution deal or that kind of thing." And they made a fortune off of this stuff at a point where they were going bankrupt on blockbuster movies that they were putting out that nobody wanted to watch. And so when you looked at where these movies are playing, right, the black exploitation movies were not playing in the suburbs; they were playing in the inner cities, and these were the same inner cities that had the Chinatown theaters that were playing kung fu movies. And so not it didn't take too long for those movies to cross over, so that these kids like RZA, Jizza, all the folks in the Wu-Tang Clan, they're going to see a black exploitation movie and on the same bill as a kung fu movie. And so they're like, at first, I'm sure they're like, what's going on here? And then they realize, wow, Bruce Lee and these other, kung fu heroes, they're just like the black exploitation heroes. They're fighting the man. They're fighting the oppressors, right? And so that's the link is racial segregation and where these movies were screened.
Yeah,
Um,
and that adds to the controversy, I guess, about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is a
yes,
movie about the film business. So,
the film business,
as
absolutely.
you note, the Hollywood depended on these movies. So,
On the B on these on these B movies
on
to hold on.
Tarantino's assault on Lee is particularly controversial. What about going the other way,
Mm,
Jeff? Your biography of Lee writes about his journey from China to the United States, and he effortlessly or relatively effortlessly seems to go backwards and forwards. But did the Lee phenomenon make a big impact in Asia, in the mainland of China, in Japan, in Korea? Is he as much a symbol of what it is, whatever it is to be Asian, as he is in the United States?
yeah, I think he was then, and I actually have to go back and correct you. He had a very difficult time in the U.S., and I think that this is one of the things that a lot of previous, sort of tellings of the Bruce Lee story have kind of glossed. He when he came to the U.S., he hadn't been a great student in school. So even
Mm,
though he studied in a British colony and English was there in his curriculum from a very young age, he was still very bad at English. You know, he carried around uh, sort of these books that were about, you know, American idioms, you know what I mean? So that you could figure out what it was that he was saying in conversations. Um, but he learned it, he learned it and mastered it very quickly. But and again, I as I told you earlier, he realized very early on that he was living in these segregated neighborhoods. So you know, all of this is part of the story of Bruce Lee, and maybe it's, you know, glossed over, it's sort of downplayed to emphasize that this was a man on a mission. He was always destined to be this world changing hero. So I just wanted to say that. But what happens is he goes to Hollywood, and he becomes a sidekick in this TV show called The Green Hornet. And that show plays for a year. It's powerful in some ways because for a lot of kids, this is the first time they've seen kung fu, and this is the first time that they've seen an Asian man literally kicking ass on TV.
mm,
And yet when the show ends, he has no parts. He can't. He has a very difficult time getting parts, and so he needs to go back to Asia because he realizes that Hollywood doesn't see him the way that he sees himself, which is as a main character, right? He sees himself as a hero, as the star, as somebody who can lead these movies, and Hollywood doesn't think so at all. In fact, the TV show that he's up for, called Kung Fu, which he's helped to popularize, this whole martial art called kung fu. He's up for this part and he gets denied, and it goes instead to David Carradine, who plays the role in Yellowface. And
mm.
so he needs to go back to Hong Kong in order to be seen as a hero. And when he does that, he hits the mark in a way that Hong Kong has never seen and Asia's actually never seen. Like he becomes literally the biggest star in Hong Kong within like 6 months of him being in Hong Kong. And and when the movies are playing in Hong Kong, they don't just play there. They play in the Philippines, they play in Singapore, they play in Vietnam, they play in Malaysia, they play in Taiwan, and they play even in Japan, which has already got the biggest, you know, movie industry going. But Bruce's movies displace a lot of the Japanese films from the tops of the charts in Asia because he is representing this sort of anti-colonial spirit that's sweeping across Asia, and of which the Vietnam War is a part, right? And in that way, he gives folks an image, a symbol to be able to latch onto, and it's very easily translatable across all of these countries at that particular time. Because again, you know, this is a period of fighting the man, you know. But in Asia, in which case, you know, Britain, the U.S., some of these other countries are seen as
Has he remained a symbol? I mean, when one thinks of some of the success stories of Asia, like Singapore or
Mhm.
Xi's China, tend to be more conservative. Does is he still seen by young people as a rebel, as a model, perhaps for rebellion?
You know, I don't think he's seen as much as a model for rebellion in Asian countries as he is here in the U.S. and in Western countries and even in Africa. Um, and well, maybe India, you know, but I think in the countries where he was first hitting, he's not necessarily seen by younger generations as a symbol of aspiration anymore. I think it's much more shifted in terms of that to the wait for young people, for youth culture, towards, you know, the singers and the dancers, the sort of K-pop type stars. Um, I think
Who are much less rebellious in a fundamentally different way.
yeah, Yeah, yeah. Maybe it's a different kind of period and a different kind
Well,
of
it certainly is.
time.
I want to end on that. Finally, a
Mhm.
couple more questions,
Sure.
Jeff, before you run.
Mhm.
The book looks great. Congratulations on it. Congratulations to your publisher.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about the title, Water Mirror Echo. It has a, shall we say, a Chinese quality. Why do you choose those three words?
It was part of these lines from a Taoist text that Bruce memorized at a very young age and that he kind of struggled to understand for all of his life. So most of us who may have come in contact with Bruce may know the line, his most famous line, the first line, which is "moving be like water."
Mm,
But there's two other lines, right? The other two lines are the whole thing is moving be like water, still be like a mirror, respond like an echo. And these are Taoist lines that also kind of work their way into Zen philosophy, Zen Buddhist philosophy as well. And these are things that he takes to heart and he's trying to figure it out. So be like water becomes an idea of how to be adaptable in a fight or in any kind of struggle that you might be in, how to be changeable, how to be moldable, in order to win, right? Athletes use it, social movements, activists from Hong Kong to Catalonia have used it. But the other two lines, I think it's part of the tragedy of his dying at 32 is that he never got to feel like what it would mean to be still like a mirror or to
mm.
respond like an echo. And so instead, he continues to mirror our dreams and our ambitions all around the world. And his lines are, kind of echoing across the generations as well.
Although the great die young, don't they, Jeff?
Unfortunately,
How
that's
did he
all too
die?
true. Yeah.
How did he die?
He died of a cerebral edema, and it's still very mysterious. Um, People couldn't believe that somebody who seemed so alive on the screen had died a month earlier. The film debuted a month after he passed away, but he literally just took an aspirin and he went to sleep and he didn't wake up.
Who were his heroes when one thinks of his work, and particularly the way you present it in Water Mirror Echo? I think of Kurosawa. Was he? I just saw or rewatched his movie Ran. Was he influenced by other filmmakers, other artists, other writers? Who did he really revere? Who inspired him?
He was really into the sort of late 60s, early 70s rebellious American cinema, so he loved Bonnie and Clyde.
Who
He
doesn't?
exactly, right? But these are the kinds of movies that he wanted to make, and he left us with these movies that some of them are good, some of them are better, but none of them are the kinds of movies that I think he really wanted to make, and I think that's the other part of the tragedy is what might have been had he gotten the script, that and the director that he really needed to get.
So many questions. Remarkable man. Finally, Jeff, in the fall of 2025, what lessons does Bruce Lee still offer? Not just Asian America, but all Americans.
I think that he offers two major lessons. I think the first is persevere, right? Water mirror echo. This idea is about how you move through the difficulties that you might be experiencing in your daily life. So I think that's part of it, and the other part of it is that you don't get through it alone. His story is one of connecting with people of all kinds of different backgrounds. So it's a story of solidarity and it's a story of unity. And I think that's maybe what I take in this particular historical moment as the biggest lesson that he has to teach us.
Wow, very good stuff from Jeff Chang. His new biography, major new book, Water Mirror Echo: Bruce Lee and the Making of Asian American. Fascinating new study of Bruce Lee, politicizing in some ways. Bruce, thank you so much, Jeff, and keep fighting.
You too, Andrew. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.